Welcome back. Although the term racism usually denotes race-based prejudice, violence, discrimination or oppression, the term can also have varying and contested definitions. The Oxford English Dictionary says racism is a belief or ideology that all members of each racial group possess characteristics or abilities specific to that race, especially to distinguish it as being either superior or inferior to another racial group or racial groups. The UN does not define racism. However, it does define racial discrimination. Any distinction, inclusion, restriction or preference based on race, colour, descent or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural or any other field of public life. Well, as we've covered in the first half of the programme, at the top of the agenda, Iran's agenda was the Arab-Israeli conflict, something that many Western countries want to avoid talking about. But Israel isn't the only country with an existing dispute it wants the conference to overlook. There's the alleged genocide of Armenians by Turkey early last century that the United States is believed to be preparing to recognise. In Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe's land reform programme targets white farmers seizing their land in addition to forced expulsion from the country. And Omar al-Bashir, Sudan's president, has even been indicted by the International Criminal Court over charges relating to the conflict in Darfur. With us are my guests in Tehran, Said Mohammed Mirandi, in Geneva, Ramu Damadoran, and in New York, Shai Franklin. Dr. Mirandi, can I come to you in Tehran? Ethnicity does bring up a whole different experience of racial intolerance, and we saw in Australia their Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, soon taking office as he did, apologising for the actions of white settlers. It's easy to say sorry about something in the past. It's more difficult when there's an ongoing conflict, though, isn't there?
That's right. The fact that he did apologize is significant. But the only way to really address the issue is for the victims of racism to be compensated for the past. And the same is true beyond Australia. Even today, when we look at Africa, which has been destroyed really in the past centuries by Europeans, or Latin America, South America, which the United States has devastated through the support of right-wing regimes in the past, these regions have to be, not only should the countries that have caused these problems accept the role that they've played, but they also have to help and rebuild the destroyed infrastructure of these areas in order to compensate the people and to create a better world and to prove that we have really put racism aside.
Ramu Damadoran, in Geneva, how difficult is it to tackle subjects like Darfur, Zimbabwe, and other locations or peoples like the Romanis perhaps of Europe when you were negotiating or will negotiate this final communique that will come out on Friday? Because these are still ongoing and to some people they are very important issues that haven't been addressed. Have they?
No, absolutely. But I think that one of the important benefits of this conference is that it puts the entire framework, if you will, within a larger arena of international law. Because you do have other forums, including the Security Council, for instance, to deal with specific issues related to peace and security. What this is trying to do is to use international law to leverage a regime that everyone accepts, which will preclude instances of the nature that you mentioned or others that have happened from occurring again. And this has to be done incrementally through a set of international conventions and covenants. It has to be done nationally through national legislation by governments. It has to be done in partnership with civil society. And despite all that has been said, and a lot of it quite legitimately, about the difficulties of Durban in 2001, the amount of instruments and actions that have taken place between 2001 and 2009 on aspects which are directly related to racism is phenomenal. And I think that's something that bears repeating.
Shai Franklin, can I just bring you in here about issues that certainly the Americans didn't want to touch upon? And if we sort of turn it on its head, acknowledging history can open up a can of worms. I just mentioned earlier that the US Congress could possibly recognise the genocide of Armenians by Turks. The subject was touched upon by the recent visit of President Obama to Turkey. One might say, shouldn't America mind its own business in issues like this? It's willing to stick its oar in, you might say, over in Turkey and Armenia, but yet not attend a conference or be involved in a conference like this.
Look, the United States is more involved over the last 35, 40 years in trying to broker a Middle East peace than any other country, especially since the Soviet Union no longer exists. So to say that the United States is being selective, look, we are selective in some ways. We try to help our allies. We try to criticize our enemies, but we also try to help where we have a good relationship with the country. It's a tremendous opportunity to help promote change in that country. And when it comes to Central and Latin America, you know, it didn't begin with the United States. It goes back to Spain, obviously. And I think there's a difference between racism and colonialism. They overlap, but they are different. And in addressing colonialism, I think the Europeans have perhaps many more issues going into this conference than the United States does. The issue of slavery is something that the United States is addressing, but the reparations to Africa, the racist overtones to colonialism go far beyond the United States.
Saad Miranda, you had a wry smile on your face as Shai was speaking there. Fill us in on the joke.
Well, I think that your good guest in New York forgets about the American Indians that have been slaughtered altogether almost, and the fact that African Americans have been held slave for centuries in the United States. But I think what's also important, and we have to take into account here, is that until racism and such issues as racism are not dealt with at the top, we really can't solve the issues at the bottom. The very fact, for example, that the Security Council, the UN Security Council, is dominated by white Europeans and Americans. It is dominated by Western Europe and North America. They have a right of veto, and therefore they have special privileges that makes them above the rest of the world, that makes them above Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The fact that in the United States the ideology of American exceptionalism, which both President Obama and Senator McCain believe in, and they've spoken about American exceptionalism, is itself a form of seeing oneself and one's country as somehow being inherently superior to others. And these are dangerous issues. And I think that religion, as earlier discussed by your good guest, is not something that promotes racism. And I think that that is why President Ahmadinejad spoke about Zionism and not Judaism. I think that Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and other global religions do see human beings as equal, but when one ideology, if it uses religion or not, sees a certain set of people superior to others, then we have major problems.
Shai Franklin, I mean, we live in a modern world, you know, we have to be realistic about this. I mean, we've seen progress in terms of a G8 becoming a G20. Do you think the Security Council, there's been talk about expanding the Security Council, countries like Brazil and India would love to be as permanent representatives there. Do you think that is the way forward to try and combat racism and discrimination by including countries that would never have normally been there post-World War II?
We talk about countries and nations, but the United Nations is really a collection of governments, and that's part of its strength, it's part of its limitation. What the United States owes to Native Americans has not begun to be addressed in a proper way, and the professor is right about that. Slavery, to some extent, is being addressed as a past issue which needs to be applied to current discrimination and economic issues. But in terms of redress to the nations that have been disadvantaged by racism and colonialism, those nations are not getting the money necessarily. The money goes to the governments, which in many cases are not democratic. And maybe that's the fault of former colonial powers, not so much the United States, more probably Spain, which had less of a democratic tradition as an empire than the British Empire did. But it becomes very political. So just realistically, I don't think we're going to see the Security Council enlarged. If it is enlarged in terms of the permanent voting members, then some new entity will be created by the powers with a small p. That is to say, those that have, let's be honest, those that have the major nuclear arsenals, those that fought successfully, let's say, won World War II, That's the nature. And there are other political realities within the United Nations beyond the Security Council. There's the Islamic bloc, there's the Arab League, there are other regional blocs. So that exists. We are not going to get beyond states and governments and regimes and individual leaders in some cases. I don't think that Iran is ruled by one person. Iran is, I think, has some democratic dynamic that ebbs and flows, like many countries do. But in some cases, we really are. Look at Zimbabwe. We're dealing with one person. And that's an extreme example, but there are many other examples like that. So if we're going to compensate Zimbabwe for slavery, we're sending money, we're sending hard currency to President Mugabe, which I don't think would be positive. So there are concerns about that, plus Europeans and Westerners generally do have qualms about addressing their own past. But let's also face it, the United States is not a white society. Within the next 20 years, the majority of Americans will not be white.
I'm afraid, Shay, there we have to stop it as we've run out of time. But I would like to thank all of my guests in Tehran, Saeed Mohammed Mirandi, in Geneva, Ramu Damodaran, and in New York, Shai Franklin. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. We do welcome your comments and suggestions, so please do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Until next time, goodbye.